I'm Kate Carver. I'm the project manager for the Great Fen, which means that I have an overview of all the different aspects of the Great Fen. Just a very quick word about how we arrange ourselves and how the project is delivered, because I'll be referring to some of these agencies as we go along. So there are 5 project partners who work together to deliver the Great Fen, and here they are. I'm sure you'll be familiar with most of those. You may not know about the middle level. The middle level commissioners are the body that basically look after the drainage of the East Anglian Fens, and particularly our part of the Fens. They're also responsible for the maintenance of the high level water carriers that carry the pumped water out to the North Sea. They're responsible for navigation on the high level water carriers. They're responsible for flood attenuation as well. So 5 project partners working together, and their goal is to deliver the Great Fen. Our logo is along the bottom. The other important logo there, which I'll just mention very briefly, is the Heritage Lottery Fund, because the Great Fen has received a lot of HLF funding. In 2008, we received 7.2 million, which was the largest ever grant for an environmental project from HLF, and we've since had a top-up of another 2 million, and I'll be referring to funding as we go through. So just a quick word about where we are geographically and chronologically, and also a bit about the geology. So the Great Fen is this small, oh, has this got a light on? Oh, no. Oops, okay. Great Fen is the small green blob there. Right on the very western edge of the East Anglian Fenland Basin. Modern day populations to the north of us is Peterborough, which is a sort of exponentially growing city. It's reckoned that it's going to be 30,000 new homes in Peterborough over the next 20 years. To the south of us is Cambridge. And then around the periphery of the Great Fen are various small towns and villages, including Huntingdon and various other little villages. So right on the western edge of the Fenland Basin, this was a huge area, some 300,000 hectares historically, which by the end of the Ice Age was covered in forest. Marine inundations and fluvial inundations over the millennia caused the forest to decline, to fall, and so peat was formed in this depression. So really the starting point of the Great Fen is that peat. It's the peat and the topography, the fluvial deposits, the landscape of lakes and little rivulets, which is now completely lost. So really a lost landscape from this East Anglian Fenland Basin. And what we have, after centuries of human intervention, after centuries of drainage, is a landscape that looks something like this on the left there. So this was an image taken about 15 years ago, and it shows the massive drainage that's taken place, the really high intensity arable production. So this is an area of the country that's one of the most productive in terms of arable production. The peat soils are very important for the production of high value crops such as carrots, onions and potatoes, etc. But dotted around within this arable desert, if you like, are little remnants of that original Fenland ecology, areas of natural and semi-natural fen. 2 of those are the 2 National Nature Reserves, Home Fen and Walton Fen, and here you see them delineated by the green line amongst the arable fields. Both very important for their surviving Fenland species, both National Nature Reserves. Home Fen, SSSI, a geological conservation review area. Walton Fen, SSSI, also a Ramsar site, which is a European wetland designation. And just looking at that picture, you can see the problem. Isolated from each other, with no hinterland to protect and sustain the Fenland ecology. Loss of species. So, for example, swallowtail butterfly, no longer found in our part of the Fens, although still found in the Norfolk Broads, and the large copper which disappeared from Walton Fen around about 1850. Why did they survive? Why did those two little pockets survive? Walton Fen survived because of Charles Rothschild. There he is with his butterfly net, member of the banking family, the Rothschild family. In 1910, he bought Walton Fen, probably for its shooting interest because he was a sportsman, but he was also a great entomologist, particularly interested in dragonflies, and he quickly realised that Walton Fen was a repository of wetland species. He also realised that in order to protect them, you had to protect where they lived. And he began to use Walton Fen as a private nature reserve for him and his family. Walton Fen is still very important today, over 40 species of dragonfly, for example, botanically important species such as the fen violet, which is only found in a couple of other locations. The other little pocket of survival is home fen. Unusual for the fens because it has an area of birch woodland within it, but in terms of habitat it's important because it has a very small area of collapsed acidic bog in the centre of home fen, very rare habitat. Also, you may have heard of the home fen posts, and that's the home fen post on the right hand side there. To the north and east of home fen, there used to be a huge inland water body called Whittlesea Mia that was drained in the 1850s. And the chap who drained it, William Wells, realised that when the Mia was drained, the peat surrounding the Mia would start to shrink. And he had the idea of planting a metal post into the ground with the top of the post level with the surface of the ground, so that as the Mia was drained, as the surrounding peat dried, as it contracted, as it desiccated, as it oxidised, the ground surface would begin to drop away. So now that pole is 14 to 16 feet, I can't remember quite, 16 feet I think, above datum, above ground level. And it just shows how that peat resource is disappeared from the fens. And peat levels vary over the depth of the project. In some areas they're about 4 metres, in other areas they're about 10 centimetres, and it's reckoned that we lose about 2 centimetres of peat a year. So what is the Great Fen all about? This is our vision. So what we want to do is to transform this area, 3,700 hectares, by linking the two nature reserves, by creating new habitats around them, and really giving wildlife somewhere to live, somewhere to spread out, places where the Fenland ecology can be fostered, can be protected. So that Google image is of a landscape that does not yet exist. It's a 50 to 100 year vision, and that's the landscape that we want to leave behind for our children and grandchildren. On the left is our project area. So the dark green are the two nature reserves. The bright green is land that we currently own, and the pale green is land that we'd like to acquire over the next 50 to 100 years. On the western boundary, on the left-hand side, there's a railway line, so that's quite a sort of immutable boundary. That's the East Coast Main Line. And there's one road that goes through the centre of it from east to west, the B660. So that's our vision. And how are we going to achieve this vision? We have a cunning plan, a master plan, which was created by the project partners. We have 4 aims. And the first aim is all about creating that natural environment, creating those new habitats, a mosaic of different habitats, delivering sustainable wildlife, but also with heritage benefits. We want to also manage the Great Fen in ways that help us to adapt to climate change and to mitigate the effects of climate change. We have social aims, which really are all about making this new green area accessible so that people can enjoy it and get close to wildlife, learn about their heritage. And we have economic aims, which are to contribute to the local economy. So just looking at those 4 aims, and the first one, creating habitat, Well, essentially what we're trying to do is to work with the natural topography and to work with the available water resource to create plant communities. We've had modelling work done for us. This was done by the CEH, and it's one of the options for different assemblages that we might begin to achieve over the extent of the Great Fen area. So these models look at the available water resource from groundwater, from precipitation, from limited extraction. And towards the northern part of the project area, that's the lowest lying land. So theoretically, this is land we should be able to get wettest, where we might be able to achieve these plant communities, reed bed, fen meadow. As we move south, the land begins to rise, less opportunity to get it wet, different sorts of habitat, seasonally wet grassland and areas of dry grassland. So that's just one model. It may not end up looking like that. We've had to adapt the model to take into account climate change predictions as well. But that's the basic theory. And how do we actually create the new habitats? We're dealing with land that's been in arable production for a long time. So it's been heavily drained, it's been pretty well trashed, some areas of it. It's full of nitrates and phosphates. Typically we take land back that's had perhaps a final crop of potatoes or onions, something like that. And in the first instance we'll seed it with grass seed, generally a standard mix. The purpose of that is to try and create a sward, to try and stabilise the top 10 centimetres or so of peat, which is very degraded. That's also good for repressing arable weeds. And probably in the first year or so, we're not doing much to manipulate the water levels. After a year or two, we're able to take a hay crop. And again, the hay is useful because it helps to pull out those nutrients from the peat. Followed perhaps by some aftermath grazing, perhaps sheep in the first instance, so quite low intensities. So they're helping to break down the swards to give those delicate fen species a chance to emerge. And after a couple of years, hopefully we've got better control of the hydrology. We're beginning to raise the water table. We're doing things like reprofiling ditches. And then we're introducing heavier herbivores, cattle, etc., grazing on an extensive basis again, who by mechanical actions of their feet, for instance, creating ponds and pools so that you get a landscape of tussocks and hummocks for breeding waders. So how do we know that we're succeeding? We have an ecology officer, Josh, and we're beginning to establish our baseline records, essentially, so that we know where we are when we start, and then we know how we're beginning to impact upon the landscape. So the theory is that we create the habitats and then species move in, and we begin to get that succession that Alan spoke of. So unlike some organisations, we're not species driven. So we're finding in the new grasslands that we're getting a lot of small mammals, which has been great for the raptors. So we're having a lot of raptors as well. A lot of waterfoals, huge number of waterfoals in the ditches, and larger mammals in the grasslands and the watercourses, including some we don't want, like the American mink there. We do a lot of bird monitoring, so breeding bird surveys, wintering bird surveys. We have a system of raptor nesting boxes. We monitor those, we do bird tagging. And really the bird species, they're a good indicator of large-scale habitat change and of the food-prey availability. We also do a lot of monitoring for invertebrates, and again they're excellent indicators of habitat change. And what we're finding is really rapid colonisation in the restored areas. And all sorts of interesting things are popping up. So for instance, last year we found the tansy beetle, which is this one here, which again is only found in, I think, one other or two other sites in the UK. And also plant surveys as well, so botanical walks, ditch vegetation surveys, and again these are excellent indicators of the water level, so our manipulation of the water table and of water quality. And we also do abiotic monitoring as well. We're particularly interested in looking at how the peat is moving through the soil. So dip wells are useful for that, that vertical movement. We're also interested in water quality because, as I said, this is former arable land, so it's full of nitrates and phosphates and other unpleasant things. We monitor through fixed point photography, so we're actually recording how the landscape changes. We monitor rainfall. Much to the delight of my colleague Josh, we've just bought a drone, so we're able to do some drone photography to look at high-level changes of habitat change and succession. And of course, these environmental conditions affect all the species we find on site. So what's happening, that's the monitoring side, and what's actually happening on the ground. So there you see Walton Fen, the National Nature Reserve, and the area in grey to the north of it is an area called Rhymes Reed Bed. So it's about 130 hectares or so. And we took it back in about 2011. Last crop was onions, and that's what it looked like, the top photo when we took it back. So tons and tons of waste onions just left on the surface of the land, rotting onions. It was full of plastic, real mess. And what we're hoping to achieve is a big reed bed. So that's a design drawing for Rhymes Reed Bed. We're hoping to achieve 7 hectares of open water, a big reed bed, areas of wet grassland and dry grassland. And this is quite an interventionist approach for us in this particular area, because this has involved sculpting the landscape, so creating these new water bodies, creating 2 new channels. So pale blue shows one channel in that direction, one channel in that direction. Removing the rectilinear field drain system that you can see surrounding the reed bed, putting in water control structures, gradually raising the water levels. We can't raise them too quickly, because if you do, you just end up with soup, because the top centimetres is so degraded as a peat. You have to be very careful how you raise the water levels. And what we're aiming at is something like this artist impression here. That was just some interpretation we did to explain to people how we're changing the landscape and what we want to achieve. We put in a tower hide on the corner so that people could watch the diggers at work when the channels and pools were being excavated, and could also watch wildlife. That's an artist's impression of what it will look like in 5 years' time and 10 years' time. And already wildlife is moving into Rhymes Reed Bed. So even whilst the diggers were in there, wildlife was moving in. That's just some of the bird species. Lots of excitement last winter because a great grey shrike appeared, and we had birders from all over the country who came to see the shrike. And this year, great excitement because a rough-legged buzzard has wintered up there as well. We're also doing the next block, another 130 hectares further east. 5 minutes, oh dear, okay, I'm going to have to speed up. And this is a different design approach. So here we've got design drawing here, sinuous channels, shallow depressions, scrapes. Again, big project, we've just finished this spring. We've just got the water control structures in, and the water levels are coming up. And eventually, we're not planting with reed in both Rhymes and Kester stocking. We're relying on natural regeneration, and already reed is beginning to regenerate in these areas. And then this autumn we're also going to start on Engine Farm, which is the area in red there. That's partly within the footprint of that big inland water body I mentioned, Whittlesea Mia. And that gives us the opportunity to create some new habitats because the soil is more calcareous within the footprint of the former Mia. So some peat soils on the southwest side, some calcareous soils on the top. Engine Farm is also very important because it's beginning to give us that connectivity between habitats, and you can see the green areas are areas we've got under restoration, the NNR on the left hand side, and the red block of Engine Farm will give us that connectivity. So after the first 10 years, we've now got about a third of the area under active restoration. If you include the NNRs, it takes up the total to about 1,700 hectares, and we now own 55% of the project area. We have lots of challenges to delivery. It's a complicated business trying to rewild areas of lowland Britain that have been intensively farmed. The tenancies and landholding are very difficult. Within our project area, we have some long-term agricultural holding act tenancies, so those are those 3-generation tenancies. And if those farmers want to carry on farming with their normal arable production, we have to allow them to do that. Moreover, nothing that we do can affect their ability to farm. So we can't just start raising water levels willy-nilly, we have to make sure that we don't flood their arable land. Which means in effect that we're working on a piecemeal basis because we don't have full management control of our project area, and we certainly don't have full hydrological control because there are 5 separate hydrological units within our project area. The water availability and abstraction is a real issue as well. It's very hard to get abstraction licenses for summer abstraction, and at the moment, although we can abstract water in the winter, we can't necessarily store it or move it to where we need it, so that's an issue. We have to get consents and permissions for everything we want to do. Water abstraction, planning permissions for things like installing water control structures, that's very difficult. Protected species is a challenge, and I'm sure you know all about protected species, so I won't go on about that. But we only have certain windows of time in which we can work on the landscape, and the water voles are a good example of that, so we can only do work in the autumn around the water voles. And the funding is a constant pressure as well, as is raising match funding for the things like the HLF grants. I was going to give you a couple of quick examples of how things can be complicated, perhaps just one. So this map shows an area called Cornies Farm in the bottom and New Decoy Farm in the top, and we want to re-wet these, but through the middle of the bottom farm there's a drainage ditch which essentially is draining the land away from land and arable production. So what we wanted to try and do was to re-divert the water flow all the way around the perimeter so that we can re-wet this and then send the water up to the arable farms that need it. This involved a huge engineering project, thrust boring under the road, and it's going to involve another couple of years' work to make the linkages between the new drains, the new culverts, so that we can avoid flooding the farmer out. So it's probably going to end up being a 3-year project that costs in excess of £150,000, something like that. And this is because we don't have full management control and full hydrological control of the whole project area. And what about those other 3 aims? How do they fit in, and what impact do they have on rewilding? I mentioned our climate change aim. One of our great aims is trying to create that connectivity. We're beginning to achieve that. Another of our aims relating to climate change is flood attenuation. This is an area that floods, and due to climate change it's flooding in winter, it's flooding in summer. And the Great Fen has potential to provide attenuation, to provide new areas for floodwater. At the moment, Walton Fen is actually used as a dumping ground for floodwater by the Mid-Level Commission, which is very injurious to the nature reserve, and we're trying to find alternative areas where this water can safely go. And so we may come to a point where we begin to embrace the concept of sacrificial habitat areas. So perhaps areas that we've restored, say perhaps to dry grassland, but in an emergency could be used for floodwater storage rather than dumping it on the nature reserve. So that may be one of the balances that we have to embrace and pursue. The rest of the slide is about locking in carbon, which I probably haven't got time to go into. I mentioned our third aim, which is all about accessibility, making the Great Fen accessible for people to enjoy, whether it's on foot or by bicycle, not just physical accessibility, but also intellectual accessibility. So we have big programs of education, not just in schools, but also in the community. And we do quite a lot of heritage education as well. And our fourth aim is to try and contribute to the local economy. And it's one of the big perceptual challenges of the Great Fen that we're taking land out of agricultural production. You know, this is East Anglia, this is where food is grown. And a lot of people, and particularly the older residents in our area, have great issues about that. And one of the things that we try and get over is that the land is still being managed, and there are still opportunities for agricultural production, but different opportunities. So rather than arable crops, we now have hay meadows, we now have grazing herds. We work with graziers to graze the Great Fen. And we try and support the local economy through things like our procurement processes, through creating opportunities for training for volunteers, for example. And we're also trying to create a tourist economy for the Great Fen. We're not trying to achieve something like the Norfolk Broads, but we're trying to achieve a limited visitor infrastructure to try and create a growing tourist economy. So we have the concept of developing a central hub and satellite sites, all of which offer people different reasons to enjoy and visit the Great Fen. We're beginning to roll out our branding, if you like, over the project area. We're putting out interpretation panels which tell people the story of the Great Fen and how the landscape is changing. There's lots of good stuff on our website. But we realise that we have to strike that balance between public access and this rewilding vision. And so we have a concept of zoning, where some areas such as Rhymes Reed Bed will always be quiet areas of high conservation value with very limited access, and other areas will be more publicly accessible, where you can ride your bike or walk your dog, etc. So we're beginning to put in some of the visitor infrastructure. We're putting in a new information point. So this is one of the farms that we're developing, really as a microcosm for the broader Great Fen, with a car park, some scrapes and ponds, with waymarked walks, interpretation, and we also have plans for a new visitor centre, and that's the winning design, and that's the interior, so with great big picture windows that look over the new landscapes. So in summary then, we might say that we are attempting to create this visionary landscape, but it's very much a landscape that's tempered by pragmatism, because we do have all these constraints and all these challenges to delivery. So the areas that we've restored, this is where we're giving natural processes, giving them a chance to evolve, giving wildlife a chance to flourish, but it has to be within a carefully managed framework, which is largely geographical and largely historical, because, you know, we're in the lowland of England here, we're in East Anglia. And we also have to consider our Great Fen aims as a whole. Lots more information on our website, and thank you for listening.